أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا أقسم بيوم القيامة ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة أيحسب الإنسان أن لن نجمع عظامه بلى قادرين على أن نسوي بنانه بل يريد الإنسان ليفجر أمامه يسأل أيان يوم القيامة صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين. The verses of the Quran that I've recited, taken from chapter 75, I interpret as follows. Indeed, I promise by the period of rising up again, and I promise by the soul that learns. Does a person think that we will never collect his or her skeletons? Yes, indeed, we are quite capable of making him or her whole again. Alas, the human being desires to do further wrong. He or she questions, when is this period of rising up? Today is an unusual day for members of the Ahmadiyya International, Ahmadiyya Anjuman Isha'at Islam worldwide. For while one member is celebrating his birthday today, myself, we have another important key person who is in fact at the point of death. Our Mrs. Samina Malik from Ohio, many of you know, had recently, a couple of days ago, suffered a stroke and massive hemorrhage in her brain, and it is likely they may remove the ventilator that she's on perhaps later today. Now, obviously, when we hear about death, one of the first things that comes to our mind is, can we avert it? Can we stop it? Can we postpone it? Can a person rise again from a state in which it appears to be that they are leaving this world? That concept of rising after death is called, in all religions, resurrection. To be erect again, to rise up again. And resurrection is a principle of all religions, and it is relevant to this life. Unfortunately, we find that there are many people who consider resurrection to be only life after death. After you die, you will be resurrected, without understanding that resurrection is a principle of life. Because resurrection does not mean to rise up to heaven. It means to rise up, indeed, it means to rise up, to be put upright, to give new life to something or someone. And it even means to go straight forward. In other scriptures, resurrection is applied to, or interpreted to apply to this life. But among Muslims, that does not seem to be so. Resurrection is relegated or left towards and understood to be only in the life hereafter. It is important for us to understand this concept of rising up and resurrection, both in this life and the life hereafter. Because one of the key features of the Ahmadiyya movement is dealing with the issue of resurrection as promoted by those who interpret what is stated in the New Testament. For example, in one of the letters of Paul, he says, if Christ is not resurrected, your faith is in vain. In other words, if you don't believe or don't accept the fact that Christ has resurrected, has come rise up from the dead, as they interpret it, then you're wasting your time in having any faith. And if Christ be not risen, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is also in vain. And that is why one of the key features of the Ahmadiyya movement is indicating that, look, that concept of resurrection, of just rising up from death, is not going to bring salvation to anyone. And we therefore clarify both the teachings of the New Testament and the Quran that Jesus did not die on the cross, nor was he resurrected. He did die a natural death, and he did resurrect as any other person, every other human being will go through that same process. So we find in other scriptures, for example, among Hindus, they have the concept of reincarnation, that is, you come back in this life. They apply to this life as some kind of creature. And is therefore another version of resurrection, another interpretation of what resurrection is. But resurrection is an important principle of this life. And perhaps in coming sermons I will deal more with the different aspects of resurrection as dealt with in the Quran. Because resurrection always comes after death. Always. Whether in this world or in life hereafter, or whatever interpretation or form, you have a resurrection, it means rising up after death. But the question arises as to what is death? Now, death is really the cessation of life. We know that. That when life has come to an end, you're dead. But there are different interpretations in the Quran also of death. The Quran says, Allah takes your soul at the time of sleep as well as the time of death, and death is therefore, sleep is therefore considered to be a kind of death. There are different expressions in the Quran that indicate that other than the end of life, there are different deaths. There's spiritual death, for example, moral death. There's death of nations, there's death of individuals, and more of these we will be discussing perhaps later on. So that the Quran deals with the issue of death by pointing out to us sometimes when you become senseless. Your senses are you want to not bear any pain. That is expressed in the words of Mary when she was delivering Jesus. She said, oh, I wish I would have died before this. In other words, I wish my pain would go away. And the Quran also uses any decrease in the power of intelligence or understanding or ignorance. All of these are considered to be intellectual death, that you're not thinking properly, you're not utilizing your brain. One important thing that we need to note is that death is not an attribute of God. Life is. Allah is called Al-Hayy, the ever-living, the one who doesn't die. So death is not an attribute of God. And therefore it's not something that we could put into our personality, because we can put into our personality the attributes of God, of love, of truth, and all of these have we been constantly explaining. But we cannot put death into our soul because it is ever living. Our soul will always continue. So the Quran also speaks about spiritual death in the sense of the soul when it goes through an utmost depression, and has an entire chapter that tells us how we can resurrect our soul even in this life. And so the word that is used, one of the words that is used for death in the Quran is the word maut, and it is used as the opposite of hayat. Hayat, which means life. And death therefore is the state of a thing which causes it to function, which ceases to function, develop and grow. If you look at life, you find that there are three things that determine what life is. Intaking something, to take something in for nourishment, for upkeep, for sustenance. And then whatever you take in has to have a function, it has to be utilized, and then it has to be expelled. As if you breathe in air, oxygen is necessary. It goes into our lungs, it is utilized to give energy to to different organs and function as a fuel for to assist in the biological process of the human body, and then it is expelled, it is exhaled. Similarly, food. We eat food, it has a function in the body, and then it is passed out. So the Quran uses the word death in several ways. It indicates that there's a purpose in death. Death is something that Allah has created for us. We created death and life that He might test you to see which of you is most excellent action-wise, so far as your behavior and your actions are concerned. And death is ordained for everyone. There's no exception. So to believe that, as some Muslims believe, the Prophet Idris has gone up to heaven alive and is there, or Jesus Christ or others, that is not a concept of the Quran. Everyone experiences death. In fact, the Quran says, "Kullaman alayha fan." Everything on earth is, not permanent, except the glory of Allah. Allah is permanent. He does not die. Everything else dies. And one of the reasons for that is that we should be righteous, not just for the sake of life, that I want to be good so that I can enjoy life. That teaches us that sometimes we have to have sadness in our lives, we have to have challenges, and physical death and spiritual death is referred to in the Quran, both of these, because the Quran says, twice you have made us die. So we die two times. We can die physically and we can die also spiritually. Science has gone on to give different interpretations of what death is. One of the things that we know is that formerly death used to be if your heart has stopped or if your breathing has stopped. But it has been proven that even after your breathing has stopped and after your heart has stopped, a person could still be alive. In fact, can be kept alive by machines. You stop a person's heart. I myself has had that experience. The heart was stopped, clean, washed out, but a machine was keeping me alive while operation was being done. And many people have gone to heart operations or other in the ICU and so on. They may have experienced that kind of thing. Machines breathe for you. Machines can pump your blood. Even machines can filter your blood if your kidneys are not functioning. We know that organs can function even outside of the body. You can take a person's heart and put it in somebody else and it will function. Or kidney, or liver, or other parts of the body. People, there have been face transplants as well. So that is not merely the cessation of one particular organ. And scientists and doctors have been trying for years and decades to figure out what in fact is death. They have finally come to the conclusion, in agreement with the teachings of the Quran, that what is called brain death, when your intelligence no longer can function. So that once your brain is dead, everything else, even if your heart continues to pump by a machine or whatever, or your lungs is there by means of a ventilator that is causing you to breathe, you are dead because your consciousness will not come back. So the Quran, in dealing with this subject of death, has pointed out to us that there is a purpose for life, and because there is a purpose for life, there is what is called a lifespan. Now people think that your life has a particular period in which you will die, particular point in time. The Quran does not say so. That is a misinterpretation and a translation of the Quran that says, the time is fixed. The Quran does not use the word time to mean a moment. The word uses that yawm means a period of time. A span of time is fixed. Everyone has a span of time, but that span of time could vary. Everything is created with a capacity to do things and limitations. We have the capacity to live, but we have a limitation. We can't live forever. Every action has a time frame for completion. You have to do something, you have a time frame in which you will do it. And we know that death will come at some point in time, that death will occur is in fact certain, but also avoiding death. Avoiding death is a command of Allah, is a command of God. And so people talk about natural and unnatural death. As the Quran explains and as we understand, everything is created with a plan and a purpose. There's a purpose for our life, there's a purpose for our death, there's a purpose for our living and our functioning, everything. You look at any object, you look at a clock, for example. The hands of the clock have do not have the same purpose as a battery. The battery has a purpose, or the chain, whatever you do, and the hands have a purpose. Everything has a purpose. In a vehicle, you will find that the glass has a purpose to allow light to come in and water and wind to stay out. Rubber is used for the wheels, so you get softness and it can contain the air and can be molded as a round thing so that the vehicle can move. Engine is made out of metal or aluminum, whatever it is, because it can stand the heat or so. So everything has a purpose. And there's a purpose for food. There's a purpose for our limbs. There's a purpose for the sun and the trees, and everything has a purpose. There is also a purpose for life, as well as a purpose, as well as a lifespan. And in order to have a lifespan, that has been created, because if you have a span of something, a period, as children go to school, you start the term, there has to be an end of the term. Then you know how long the term is, how many weeks, how many days, how many periods. You can calculate how many hours of learning a child will undertake. You have lessons or so, you have a time span. So in order to have a lifespan, death has been created. And for death to occur, a time has to be appointed for its occurrence at some particular point in time. And when we look at how the Quran explains life and death, we will find that you look at any object and you'll observe that the usefulness of a thing can only be known when it has achieved its purpose at some reference point. In other words, how do you know you have achieved something unless you have an end to that particular project or so? When you can now assess the effect of that and the results of it. You look at a child, for example. They have to take an exam and they have a timetable. You know when, in this particular exam, when you're going to start the syllabus and when you're going to end it, and then you have an exam where at the end of that, you have at the end of that time span that you're preparing, whether it's primary, secondary, whatever it is, whatever, you have now an exam, so you prepare. There's a particular time that is there. So time span is the end of a particular period. Is important for us to be able to assess what we learnt before, what we did before. And so the human being and the body of the human being each has a purpose to fulfill. And this is Allah's special gift to each individual. Every person in the eyes of Allah, every single one of us is special in the eyes of God, in the thinking of God. That's why He has created us. We are not just by accident. We are in fact one who has been decided by Allah that we should live and we should carry on our life. So every person is special in the eyes of Allah. Don't think that one person is more special than the others because that one is brighter, because that one is better looking, because that one is wealthier, because whatever, that one is luckier. Those are not things. Every human being is in fact special in the eyes of Allah. And how a person chooses to fulfill the purpose of life, that is a gift of Allah. God gives us an opportunity and a lifespan in which we can fulfill the purpose of our life. And He has provided several options for us, because sometimes we don't do it in a proper way and He wants to give us more time. Just as you will find a child is writing an exam and they haven't finished and they say, okay, we'll extend the time for whatever reason, for another 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So they'll tell you before, your time is up, but we'll give you a little extra 5 minutes because rain is falling or because the examiner came late or whatever. Sometimes you get an extension. You're playing a football match or cricket match and you have a point where you can't make a decision, you extend the time. So sometimes time can be extended in your life if you have not fully achieved your purpose. So if Allah determines that your purpose is not fulfilled, or if He thinks that your purpose is fulfilled, but He wants to give other people a chance to continue what He wants. So Allah also warns us that some of these options that He's given us of a lifespan are risky and can lead to the detriment of either both the body or the soul. So you may give an extra time, but then you can either win or lose. You can use it properly or not. And all of this is mentioned in chapters and verses of the Quran that if we study the Quran on a more regular basis, you'd be able to understand much of these. But Allah has created everything with a capacity and a limitation. Yes, as human beings will create a vehicle, it has the capacity to move forward, but it has the capacity to stop. You can't build a vehicle that will continue on and doesn't have a brake. So everything has a capacity and a limitation. And for example, a person has the capacity to chop another person, to kill another person with a gun, with a cutlass or a chopper, but not with a feather. You can't take a feather and chop a person. So everything has its capacity and its ability. And we must also look at the fact that if a person commits a crime or commits something, we should not think, well, that is the decree of God, Allah willed it. So if a person commits murder, we say, well, God had determined that that person should die like that, and that. If you adopt that kind of attitude, then the murderer is really an instrument of Allah, the divine hand of Allah, and therefore is not to be blamed, not responsible for the act of killing, because God wanted that person to die by murder or by accident, and you caused that, therefore you are not responsible. That is not the concept of the Quran. But the Quran points out to us that every action has a time frame and a time limit for indeed completion. And this time frame is dependent upon certain parameters, certain circumstances, certain events, certain conditions. Different circumstances will bring about different times of completion, but ultimately the action will be completed. So you're building a house, you have a time frame, it will be done in 6 months or a year, but it can be done quicker if you have more people use machines, or if you get the material on time, or if you have enough funds. And it can also go beyond time if the weather is bad, if the disappointment, if there's a strike of workers, and so many things. So time spans can differ. And so we look at it naturally. And several years, I remember in many of the classes I've held here in other mosques, I've pointed out this fact that I think the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement has also explained it in some of his, or certainly some of his followers. You take, for example, a piece of iron. There's a natural tendency of iron to rust, and it will rust until it dies, no longer existing, just in small particles of dust. You have seen it many a time, where something becomes so rusty, it's just powder. And a fixed piece of iron, an inch, 2 inches, or whatever it is, depending upon whether it's hollow or solid, has a time span in order to rust. Let's say it takes 5 years or 10 years to rust. It has a duration of time in which it will just become powder. But if the iron is painted, or if it is put away from the weather, it can last for another 20 years perhaps, or 30 years. Or if you bury it in the ground, protected in some metal container or concrete or whatever it is, it can last even a much longer time. So the time for disintegration of that rust and that iron is extended. And so the Quran wants us to understand and apply this principle of time span and lifespan to death by allowing us to realize that death will occur is certain. But when it occurs depends upon circumstances. For example, a person can die after taking poison. But when he or she will die depends on the quantity of poison. It depends on the quantity of poison taken. It can depend upon the health of the individual. It can be dependent on whether an antidote was administered. So if a person is bitten by a snake and they get the antivenom, the the poison could be, have no effect and they could continue to live a normal life. And so the question is always asked as to whether we can control death. And the answer to that is simply, if we cannot control death, then why do we take medications? Why do we go for operations? Why do we take steps to prevent death if it was not possible? And there's so much of technology today that can cause us to function. Doctors can tell you, look, if you have a particular disease, you have a heart problem, or you have a medical problem in some way, your chances of survival is maybe a year, 2 years, 5 years, 6 months, whatever. But then they can treat you with certain medications or certain diet or whatever it may be, and you can live for much longer than what the prognosis is, what they have told you. So that death can come from either natural causes or it can come from other than the hand of God in a sense, and the Quran points out to us that we have a responsibility for our life and death. So avoiding death is really a command of God when the Quran says, وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ, a very famous and well-known verse of the Quran. Do not ensure your death without having submitted. وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ. Some people translate it, die not unless you're Muslims. But Aslama in Arabic, Muslimun, means here submission to the will of Allah. So do not die, which is a command of Allah, without having submitted. And what is meant by submitted? It means submitted to all the circumstances, without having to utilize all the means necessary. So if you have to suffer in a disease and you have to take harsh medicine, you have a stomach problem and you have to take some medicine, or you have a cold and you have to take a medicine that is bitter, you say, I don't want it because I don't like it, or you have to go through some harsh operation or treatment, you have to take chemotherapy or something like that. You are required to do that, to strengthen your mind in order that you may endure that experience so that you can get better. And that's why it is so important for us to realize that we have to take all the necessary means, all the means necessary to sustain our life. And I was happy, therefore, to see that earlier this week, women took on that responsibility of having their pap smears or check for cancer so that you can have treatment as early as possible. And similarly, men did their prostate test so that they can also, determine whether they can continue a healthy lifestyle, what they're doing, or if necessary, take the necessary precaution. All of these, therefore, are how we act in accordance with the teachings of the Quran. So that the issue of life and death is not merely a simple of saying the end of life. It is a responsibility and a decision-making process. Someone asked me, for example, just a couple of days ago, as to whether, this is a big debate now in some countries of the world, and laws are being passed to call what is called MAD laws, medically assisted death. That if a person is bearing too much of pain, the doctors can administer that something to bring an end to your life. What is strange about these laws is that some years ago there was a doctor in the United States of America who was doing this on a regular basis, and he was constantly told to stop because it was not, it was against medical science. You are supposed to save life. He continued, and eventually I think he was arrested and perhaps even jailed for doing that. And what he had introduced, and the reason he had given, was people couldn't bear pain, and therefore he was merely assisting them in alleviating the pain and by bringing an end to their life. Now the laws are being passed. When you said an individual was doing something wrong, suddenly Parliament decides, the laws of the country changes, and now it becomes right. That's the kind of society in which we live in, that human beings make laws. Today it is right, tomorrow it is wrong. Today it is wrong, tomorrow it is right. Many years ago, people will have be arrested for planting marijuana or selling drugs and cocaine and all of these things. Today now it becomes legal in certain quantities, and perhaps later on it will even become illegal. Many years ago, alcohol was considered to be illegal to consume it. Now it has become legal as well. So society is making laws left, right, and center without realizing the impact on his community and society, on individuals especially. And the Quran is a book that's given to us by Allah and points out to us how we can really utilize the gift that Allah has given us of life and death. And so it is important and essential for us to realize that yes, we have to accept the fact that one day we will die. But there's a lot that we can do while we are alive, not only to sustain our body for this world, but also to prepare our soul for the life hereafter, because that soul will not die. And therefore it requires much more intense treatment in order to sustain it in this world as well as the next. And that is why we have fasting, we have so many other things, prayer, and we have giving of charity, developing of good relations, of love and interaction with each other, removing hatred from our mind. All of these are a treatment for our soul to make ourselves better human beings so that we can enjoy not only a good physical health in this world, but more so a spiritual health in this world and in the life hereafter. Barakallahu lana wa lakum fil Quran al-Azim wa nafa'ana wa iyyakum bil ayati wa zikril hakim innahu ta'ala jawadun kareem malikun barrur rahim.